We have a 50-50 split of topics here in this, our second course of actual content, the third in the series for our learning path here on the 70-411 exam. In this course, we're going to talk about network services. And I say a 50-50 split because Microsoft has essentially divided this course and this functional group into two different roles that you can install onto a Windows server. For the first half, we're going to talk about DNS. For the second half, we're going to talk about the remote access role. The first of these is an absolute requirement for any Active Directory domain or forest. I mean, if you think about all the different resources that exist in Windows in an Active Directory, these days finding resolution for those services, name resolution, is something that requires DNS to be up and operational. It's the second half of these where the complexity gets dialed up pretty much to 11. Because Microsoft's intent in having you understand the remote access role sometimes goes at cross purpose to the types of activities that your prototypical admin would do. A lot of Windows admins these days don't find themselves working all that often with remote access technologies, oftentimes because there are other technologies not coming from Microsoft that can perhaps perform the job in a much better way. And furthermore, a lot of these technologies are kind of set it and forget it. When you think about a remote access solution, whether it's from Cisco or some other hardware provider or from Microsoft itself, generally once you turn on a remote access solution, you kind of turn it on, users use it, and you really only have to come check it out whenever it's not functioning again. And so the second half of the content here in this course can be just a little bit more challenging than what you might expect, simply because you might not have that much opportunity to make use of it. Now, if you're just joining, this is actually the third of the courses that make up our learning path here at Pluralsight for the 70-411 exam. The first course was just a look at the MCSA itself and where this exam fits in the three exams making up the MCSA. This is the R2 version of this content, and so everything you'll be looking at here in this course and really throughout the entire learning path has to do with the updated objectives and probably the test questions associated with Microsoft's release of Windows Server 2012 R2. We then, with that introduction out of the way, took a look at deploying, managing, and maintaining servers. And that brings us here to, with the servers now up, how do we actually get them to talk to each other? How do we get them to resolve to each other? And how also do we get our clients to access them, whether they're inside the network or outside? Here in this course, we have four different topics that we have to deal with, the first two of which focus explicitly on the DNS role. For the first, we'll talk about DNS zones. How do you actually create zones? What are the different kinds of zones? And what are the different use cases in which you'd create one type of zone versus another? With the zones out of the way, we'll go into what is probably the easiest of the four different modules in this course, that being one on configuring DNS records. Now, I say it's easy, but what we're really talking about here is having a deep understanding of the different kinds of possible records that you could add to a DNS zone. So an A record, a quadruple A record, an SRV record, a name server versus an SOA record. All of these are important because they're necessary for the functioning of Active Directory. They're necessary really so that every client can attach to every other client or other network resources and servers. It's there that we'll change gears entirely, and we'll shift over to using the remote access role within Windows Server 2012 R2. That remote access role can be installed with up to 3 different role services that perform different functionality. For this third module in our course, we'll talk about 2 of those role services, the VPN role service and the Web Application Proxy, which is a tool that looks a lot like Active Directory Federation services, and in fact leans on ADFS for some of its functionality, but really is another way for you to expose a web application or a website out to clients that exist out on the internet. Now, in both the VPN and Web Application Proxy scenario, there are either extra steps or limitations involved in terms of what you can connect to from that outside world. In certain circumstances, you may wish to provide a LAN-like experience to your users, no matter where they may be, whether they're in the hotels, the coffee shops, the airports of the world, whether they're working from home. If they turn on their laptop, you want them to behave just as if they were working from inside your LAN. Well, Microsoft has a solution in Direct Access that can provide exactly that experience in a relatively secured way. By turning on Direct Access, you give your clients the abilities to work with pretty much every application, every website, even server-based applications that have nothing to do with the web from the luxury of their own machine. And one of the best parts about Direct Access is that it's designed to be a zero configuration experience at the user side as well. So you simply turn on direct access, you give it the right network configuration, you set up DNS appropriately, you throw the right certificates in the right places, and then you create a group policy object that takes all the appropriate configurations and installs them automatically onto every appropriate machine. What this means is that as soon as that user leaves the office and plugs in somewhere else, well, they automatically, with no extra effort, no muss and no fuss, have access to the resources that you've deemed appropriate. Now, as you might imagine, that always-on world that direct access requires probably requires some pretty heavy-duty thinking before you ever start clicking some buttons. It also requires that remote access server to be installed and configured in just the right way. Any implementation of a direct access solution is by no means trivial, but what I hope to do is give you an end-to-end installation, the whole demonstration that you could potentially install in your own environment, so at least you could get a flavor for how direct access can work. So this is our course, number 2 in the list of 6 different objectives making up the 70-411 exam. This time focusing on the Windows network services that require configuration. Coming up next, we begin with DNS zones and the variety of things you have to think about before you ever go and create a primary or secondary or any other kind of zone in DNS. In that upcoming module, we'll talk about zone transfer settings and notify settings. We'll talk about zone delegation, conditional forwarders, and this special kind of DNS zone called a stub zone, and when you would use it and why. That conversation on DNS and its zones is the topic for our next module coming up.